Hello and welcome to another episode of Republic TV's Democracy and Justice Show with Shoaib Ahmed. I'm your host, Shoaib Ahmed, and today we have a very special guest, Jon Danilowicz, former US Deputy Ambassador and Deputy Chief of the Mission to Bangladesh, to discuss what does Donald Trump's victory and presidency mean for Bangladesh. Welcome to our virtual studio, John.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and your audience today.
Yeah, we are very lucky to have you. I would like to know about the U.S. presidential election. This particular election is different because Democrats lost the presidency, they lost the House, they lost the Senate, and the popular vote, which was didn't seen in the last couple of past elections. Was it surprising to you? And what would be the three main causes you would identify for Democrats' biggest loss?
So, again, the way the U.S. electorate breaks down, you start with each candidate having a significant base of support, 40-something percent. Elections, though, are decided on what happens with that remaining 10 or so percent. In an election like this, it also depends on turnout, which side's voters were more motivated to come to the polls.
Mhm.
And as everyone analyzing the US election pointed out, really the key to this election came down to a number of swing states,
Mhm.
states in the upper Midwest and in parts of the South. So I think the greatest accomplishment of President Trump and his campaign was to focus in these areas, to focus on their supporters and to motivate those supporters to come out and vote. Sometimes the American people show that the distrust of government leads them to vote for congressional candidates from one party, even if they support a presidential candidate from another party. This is a way of maybe limiting the impact that a president might have. In this election, however, I think what you saw is that there was remarkable consistency between the voting patterns for the president and the congressional representatives. So one way to interpret this is that the voters who elected Donald Trump wanted him to be able to implement his agenda, and therefore they helped provide him with a Congress that will allow him to do so.
Yeah, yeah. Johnny, you mentioned about the turnout. This particular election, a lot of American young people, we saw it all over the campuses across America, that young people were protesting against different wars around the world and how US is involved in different wars. And do you think because many of the young people are considered, college-going young students are considered to be a vote bank for Democrats. Do you think that didn't show up, and that was one of the reasons for Democrats' biggest loss?
Well, again, I'm not a political scientist. I'm a retired diplomat. So I'm a interested observer in the US political process. In my experience and based on my observations, individuals vote or choose to vote for a variety of factors. For some individuals, it really is the overriding concern on one issue. That will be sufficient to get them to the polls and to get them to vote. I think, however, most voters probably have a basket of issues that they care about, both that motivate them to vote as well as motivate them to vote in a certain direction. It also depends on to what extent somebody thinks that their vote matters. In close elections, as we've had this time, you can certainly see how an individual may think that their vote matters in a state that's considered a swing state. In though a heavily Democratic or Republican state, a voter, even though they may have strong feelings, may become discouraged thinking that their vote ultimately doesn't matter. So they take their activism in a different direction.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's come back to Bangladesh-US relationship. Do you think the current Dr. Yunus-led interim government in Bangladesh should worry about the second Trump presidency? Why or why not?
So I've written and spoken a little bit about this. So I have a couple of taglines. So my bottom line up front for Professor Yunus and the interim government is that they should keep calm and carry on. They should focus on the task at hand, which is to promote reforms leading to free, fair elections, which will enable them to hand over power to an elected government. I think in general, though, people tend to overestimate the influence that the United States and other international actors have within Bangladesh. People are always trying to parse whether an administration, whether an individual, whether a country is pro one party or pro the other, and vice versa. People are tagged as pro US or pro another country. But I think the events of this past summer show that ultimately the destiny of Bangladesh is written by Bangladeshis. That was
Hmm.
certainly true during the 15 years plus of the Awami League government. The Awami League government stayed in power, frankly, as long as the people of Bangladesh either supported or tolerated that. And the
Hmm.
end of the Awami League government came when the people of Bangladesh decided that it was time for a change. They were denied the opportunity to express those views through the ballot box, so they
Hmm.
found another way to have their views be expressed and to prevail upon the then government to step
Hmm.
down. So I don't think, to answer your question directly, that the interim government in Bangladesh or its supporters should be overly fearful about the impact that a Trump administration will have on Bangladesh's destiny and future.
Yeah. Great. You mentioned about the destiny that is decided the Bangladeshi people themselves. Um, the fallen dictator Hasina and her son Sajib Joy immediately celebrated Mr. Trump's victory. Do they have any realistic reason for that to celebrate? And also, recent leaked phone call from Hasina to various party members outside of the countries, some including in New York and USA. She is directing to have some possessions in Bangladesh where they would carry Trump's picture, and if the police or the opposition would, if there is any clash, she direct her party members to collect those images sent to them, especially to her, and she can directly channel that to President Trump to give a bad picture about Bangladesh and the current government. Do you think Sheikh Hasina and her son or the Awami League as a party has any realistic reason to be happy about Trump's presidency?
So again, I would separate this in two areas, with the caveat again that I'm not a political scientist. Every government, every regime has to find a source of legitimacy. In a
Mhm.
democracy, that legitimacy comes through free and fair elections. Those did not take place in Bangladesh over the past 15 years, so they were not a source of legitimacy for the government or a source of support. So the government had to look elsewhere. And to her credit, Sheikh Hasina, over her 15 years in power, constructed an edifice that supported her regime. She was backed by business oligarchs. She was backed by political appointees in the administration,
Mhm.
in the security forces. She was backed, obviously, by the loyalists within her party and its various wings. To some
Mhm.
extent, she also counted on international support. But at the end of the day, what happened in July and August is that those pillars of support crumbled and she was left isolated and alone.
Mhm.
And at the end, no international party could or would support her and perpetuate her time in office. So, similarly, now if you look at the current situation, there's no international actor that's going to determine how long President or Chief Advisor Yunus's government stays in office. There's no international actor that can bring Sheikh Hasina back. And certainly, any attempt to do so would be foolhardy if she did not have and if her party did not have domestic support within Bangladesh. So if the ultimate objective is to return to power, I don't think that there's any reason for the former prime minister or her supporters to take solace in President Trump's victory. Now, that doesn't mean that there won't be changes in US foreign policy in the Trump administration. In fact,
Mhm.
I'm quite certain there will be. Those won't be unique to Bangladesh. There are certain things that President-elect Trump has highlighted during his campaign where he sees a different path for the United States than the Biden administration had. Some of
Mhm.
these will clearly affect Bangladesh, whether it's policy on climate change, immigration, trade, etc. So there will definitely be changes in US policy. But again, these challenges that these changes may present would be challenges for a government headed by Professor Yunus. They would also, frankly, be challenges for a government headed by Sheikh Hasina. So, again, the bottom line for me is that the outcome of the US election while of interest to people around the world, won't have a direct impact on Bangladesh's politics the way that I think many are anticipating.
Mhm. Okay, great. Speaking of international actor, last year when Sheikh Hasina was in power, she repeatedly accused USA about trying to remove her from the position when USA was advocating for the democracy. And she specifically were mentioning and signaling the USA wants the Saint Martin, the island, and make a military base there. And she was not allowing USA to do that. And that is the reason she was accusing USA wants to remove her from the power. Do you think that has any base?
So I often used to remark that to be a political analyst in Bangladesh, it might be more useful to have a psychology or psychiatry degree than a political science degree. And I don't understand fully all of the reasons for former Prime Minister Hasina's deep distrust and, in some ways, antipathy toward the United States. Obviously, there are incidents that have occurred in her life where she subscribes to conspiracy theories that seek to blame the United States for things that have happened. I think beyond this, though, there's a calculus that she has that she gains politically by being seen as standing up to the United States and cozying up with others. Some of this is a leftover from the Cold War, which is probably the environment that she grew up in politically, where the
Mhm.
world was divided into the two camps, Moscow and Washington. Many in her party have their political DNA on the left. So again, appealing to this old leftist, string or strain seemed to have some political appeal for her. So she would, when under threat, um, accuse the United States of all kinds of things, including the canard about St. Martin's Island. At the same time, though, when she saw it in her interest, she was more than happy to be seen as cozying up to the United States, taking a selfie with President Biden, or again,
Right.
rolling out other indications of the support which she wanted to portray that she had within the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. So, are you, so there is no US plan, as per to make a military base in San Martin?
So the United States and Bangladesh have a strong security partnership. The United States and Bangladesh have worked together around the world in peacekeeping operations. The United States and Bangladesh have worked on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, including in Bangladesh. We're partners on maritime security. So there are a variety of ways in which we cooperate. We train together. We provide opportunities for each other's military officials to attend professional military education opportunities. So there's a close and deep partnership. Again, in Bangladesh, a lot of elements of US and Bangladesh security cooperation were deliberately or otherwise misinterpreted. So, for example, when the United States wanted to negotiate relatively innocuous agreements on humanitarian assistance or to facilitate acquisition, these were blown into something of deep political and strategic importance, which, frankly, from the US side, they were not. I say all this because of the discussion on St. Martin Island. Certainly, the US has a strategy in the Indo Pacific region, is
Mhm.
looking to work with allies and partners to provide for a safe and secure Indo Pacific, and there's a role for Bangladesh to play in that. However,
Yeah.
Bangladesh's role in the Indo Pacific is not primarily a military one, and it certainly is not one in which the US or anyone else is looking to Bangladesh to provide basing. I spent some time working with the US Navy at the US Naval War College, and I doubt
Mhm.
you could find any serious US naval planner who would look at a map of the Indian Ocean region and would say that the ideal location for a military base is St. Martin Island. So again, I think that's just ridiculous on the face of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying. Another US role to restore democracy in Bangladesh, we saw in the last 2 years of the Hasina regime. US took very bold move to tell Bangladesh they should restore democracy in its own country. Peter Hush, the former ambassador to Bangladesh, uh, took many questions from the journalist, where he was personally advocating for a free, fair election, and Secretary of State was also having meeting, and there were some sanctions against some of the questionable law enforcement agents in Bangladesh. All those indicated U.S. Was serious about restoring a democracy and free, fair election in Bangladesh. Then what happened? There was a sham election in December. Hasina got elected again by uh, anybody would say that was not a free, fair election. Nobody participated. USA didn't took any measures. The kind of silence, the Peter Hush was silenced. He didn't voice out anymore. The State Department didn't articulate what their intention was and what measure they will take. What do you think happened? Why Ambassador Peter Hush didn't say anything after the election, and why the U.S. State Department didn't take any measure? What is the role they were wanted to play, and what happened really? What is your analysis?
Sure. Well, I should start here by just reminding everyone that I'm no longer a U.S. diplomat. I don't speak for the U.S. government, for the State Department, or for anyone other than myself. I just want to back up a little bit. Certainly, during the Biden administration, there was a priority given to a values agenda, including support for democracy. This was a principle that the Biden administration applied across the world, and certainly including in Bangladesh. As in any country, there are a variety of tools that the United States has to help advance its policy goals. These include roughly, or kind of broadly speaking, carrots and sticks. There are incentives that we can provide, and then there are ways that we can provide disincentives. In the case of Bangladesh, there was a policy announced in May 2023 to sanction individuals who are undermining the democratic electoral process by providing visa sanctions on them. And as you mentioned, this was not the first time that such sanctions were applied in Bangladesh. Again, the visa sanctions, I think, are a very simple tool in that the United States, like any country, ultimately has the sovereign right to determine who can enter within its borders. So what the United States was doing was sending a message to Bangladesh and the world that somebody who undermined the democratic process, somebody who engaged in corrupt activities, somebody who violated human rights was not welcome in the United States, nor were their family members welcome. This is not a right that somebody has to get a visa to the United States. It's a privilege. And the United States determined, the Congress and the executive branch, that these individuals should not have that privilege. I don't think anyone by itself thought that these sanctions or these decisions were going to be magic bullets that would ultimately affect the outcome. But they were part of, again, a broader strategy to encourage parties in Bangladesh, starting with the government, to create an environment in which free, fair elections could be held and the people of Bangladesh could express their will. I've seen and written, or heard and written a lot about the change in U.S. policy that took place toward the end of 2023 and then followed the election in January of 2024. And it's no secret that I disagreed with the U.S. policy shift. I thought that the U.S. policy announced in May was the correct one, and I was disappointed when the United States seemed to back off this. I don't have any inside information on why these changes took place. I read the Washington Post article that talked about the discussions between the United States and India. This very well may have played a role. It also could reflect a recognition from the U.S. side that the government was determined to go forward with elections. They were likely going to be able to succeed in that. A government would emerge after January that the United States would have to deal with. So I think this is the process that you saw taking place in late 2023 and early 2024. The United States, I don't think, ever changed its policy objective, which is to see democracy flourish in Bangladesh. But certainly the U.S. changed perhaps its approach. And, Ambassador Haas, who is an outstanding diplomat and who I wish well in his new endeavors, ultimately has to be reflecting the policy that's set in Washington. Ambassadors in the field can help inform policy, but at the end of the day, ambassadors carry out a policy that's determined in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you mentioned about the Washington Post article about India negotiating with USA for Bangladesh, and USA was backing off. Do you buy that theory personally? Do you think that's what happened?
Well, I certainly know that, and it's again no secret that the U.S. and India.
Just to let you know, sorry to interrupt you. Majority of the Bangladeshi people believes that. Majority of the Bangladeshi people thinks USA was influenced by India, and India negotiated out this Hasina's regime one more time from USA. Now, what is your view? You are the expert on the US, Bangladesh, and the foreign policies. So, what is your view on that?
Sure. Well, over the course of my 30 plus year career, I worked in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in Mozambique, in South Sudan, in Zimbabwe, and in Panama.
Mhm.
In every one of these cases, the United States talked with the host government about bilateral issues affecting the two countries, but we also talked about global issues and we talked about regional issues.
Mhm.
So I've never served at our embassy in New Delhi, but I have no doubt that there are regular discussions between US and Indian officials about bilateral US India issues,
Mhm.
about
Mhm.
global issues, and about regional issues. So it wouldn't be surprising to me at all, nor would it be in any way sinister to me if the US and India talked about Bangladesh.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that we're always going to agree. And I know, in fact, that in the past there have been disagreements between the United States and India about Bangladesh, and we've pursued different policies. I think the viewpoint expressed from India has often been that Bangladesh matters more to India than it does to the United States, given its proximity. And there's been perhaps some wish that the U.S. defer to India. I think, though, ultimately from the US side, it's a question of, again, priorities and resources. And I think what you've seen play out in Bangladesh is that over time, the US approach to Bangladesh has changed. The tools that we've used, perhaps the priority that we've given to it has changed. I
Mhm.
was very happy in this regard that after August 5th, when the interim government came to office, the United States responded immediately at very senior levels to demonstrate our support for the interim government and its reform agenda. And the reception that Professor Yunus received at the UN General Assembly, including from US officials, was, I think, unprecedented. I think currently US officials recognize that there's a different view in New Delhi, and I'm sure in conversations between the US and Bangladesh, US and India about Bangladesh are ongoing. But at least over the past several months, you can see a situation in which the US has adopted a different approach than India has, and I think it's the right approach.
Yeah, thank you so much. You mentioned about U.S. relying on India sometime for Bangladesh because India's stake is more to Bangladesh than USA. Does USA has a separate policy for Bangladesh, or it sees Bangladesh through the so-called eye of India, whereas India is the biggest US ally in the region?
Yeah, I don't think it's ever been the case that the US sees Bangladesh through the eyes of India.
That was the
We're
Indian claim. Many times that's what their claim was. They were
sure.
requesting or implying that US should see Bangladesh through their eye.
Right. So there's a difference between what India thinks should happen and what actually happens. So I've had the privilege on three separate occasions of serving at our embassy, the US Embassy in Dhaka. And I
Mm,
can assure you that we at the embassy in Dhaka in the past, and I'm certain those currently at the US Embassy in Dhaka, are reporting back to Washington what's happening. So I don't think there's anyone in Washington, at the State Department, at the White House, in any other part of the US government that is looking to the Indians to explain what is happening in Bangladesh. I'm confident that the U.S. views on Bangladesh and on the reality on the ground are informed by what our diplomats are reporting. Now, foreign policy formulation is a complicated topic. Obviously, the executive branch and the president have the final say. The president relies upon his National Security Council to provide him advice. On issues related to foreign affairs, the Department of State has the lead. So the Secretary of State and his subordinates will provide recommendations to the President through the National Security Council. But there are a variety of other inputs as well. There's the Congress, the private sector, the non-governmental sector, and other countries weigh in, other countries provide their viewpoints. So it's clearly the case that Indian views have been an input into US foreign policy decision making, but I wouldn't say that they have been the primary one, and frankly, nor should they be.
Okay. How important is Bangladesh to the US in terms of the foreign policy? Obviously, my observation is it's not on the top of their list, but where Bangladesh stay when it comes to the US foreign policy priority?
Yeah. So every country I've served in, people tend to overestimate the importance of that country in U.S. foreign policy. And again, that's not anything that perhaps is surprising. What I would say, though, is obviously there are bigger issues that the United States as a global power has to deal with, and those are the issues that dominate the headlines. Now, from time to time, the importance of Bangladesh will rise up. Often this is when something happens out of the ordinary. In Bangladesh's case, when there's a humanitarian disaster, for example, or when thousands of refugees from a neighboring country come across the border, or when events like this past July and August took place. So there will be times when interest in Bangladesh will spike in the United States. But in a steady state, I think Bangladesh is an important country for the United States, but it's not one of the most important. And I think our interests in Bangladesh are relatively consistent in terms of seeing the social and economic development of the people of Bangladesh, our regional stability, Bangladesh partnering on global issues such as, again, peacekeeping and refugee issues and migration. And obviously, Bangladesh is an important trade partner for the United States, particularly in the ready-made garment sector. And there are US companies in the energy sector and elsewhere who value their engagement in Bangladesh. So I think there are a variety of areas in which the US and Bangladesh work together, but I don't think it's accurate to say that Bangladesh is a top tier issue in the United States.
Obviously. Now, will Bangladesh not being in the priority list of the US foreign policies, as you just mentioned, and that's obviously logical, give India an opportunity to sabotage Dr. Yunus-led government, given that India is not a fan of this entire government? Prime Minister Modi didn't even meet Dr. Yunus in the UN General Assembly, where he got enormous support from the world leader. What do you think?
So again, I think you have to be careful as a starting point not to overestimate the influence of any international actor, whether it be the United States or Bangladesh. Certainly, my assumption is in the first months of the Trump administration, Bangladesh won't be a priority. The new administration will be busy staffing itself up. So the individuals who are looking after things will be more on kind of a maintenance mode. From Bangladesh's perspective, that's not a bad thing because the status quo trajectory is pretty favorable after the UN General Assembly meetings. Whether India or others perceive that there's a vacuum that they can step into at this time is really a question for them to answer. And don't profess to be an expert on any of these other countries. But from the perspective of what impact this will have, I don't think anyone would deny the fact that the Indian government and others were very supportive of Sheikh Hasina and wanted to see her continue in office as the events of the summer unfolded, and ultimately they were unable to do so. So I think, again, this is a good lesson in terms of the limits of international influence. The success or failure of the interim government in Bangladesh is going to be determined by whether the government can maintain the support of the population. And there may be a psychological aspect to this in which people perceive that the government is stronger or weaker because of the international environment. But as a practical matter, that won't be the determining factor in my view.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, among the Bangladeshis around the world, definitely Bangladeshis living in Bangladesh, were viewing USA as a source of support for its renewed journey to democracy. Now, President-elect Trump mentioned many times that his priority will be America first, and he's not that interested on what's going on around the world, not getting involved in every countries. Now, if the promoting democracy is not in Mr. Trump's foreign policy priority, how will that impact Bangladesh's renewed journey towards democracy?
So I think some people make the mistake of taking an overly narrow view of international relations. And they
Mhm.
think that the only determinant of relations between two countries is the relationship between the two governments or the two leaders. While governments obviously play an important role and leaders set the tone, bilateral relationships are much broader than government to government. They're really people to people. And if you look at the relationship between the US and Bangladesh, it's really a people to people relationship. It's a relationship that's informed by the views of members of Congress who listen to their constituents. It's a view informed by the opinions of citizens who have interacted with a country like Bangladesh through whether it be a non-governmental organization or an international organization they've been involved with, through their private sector engagement, through their academic journeys. And in many countries, the diaspora community plays an important role in helping to both influence policy, but also creating that larger foundation for ties. So I think in this regard, it's important to look more broadly at the relationship and to look at ways in which the diaspora and others can contribute to a broad relationship, which ultimately may impact the executive branch's view on how to take the relationship forward.
All right. President-elect Trump talked about imposing at least 10% tariff. If that happens, how that will impact trade between Bangladesh and USA?
So tariff policy is obviously a complicated one in trade policy. When you look at tariffs,
USA is one of the largest importer of Bangladeshi garments.
Sure. No, I understand. But I guess what I was going to say is, to me, it's a relative issue as well. So, for example, the reason why would Bangladesh be a important source of garment exports to the United States? It's because they can provide quality goods at a more competitive price, which is attractive to the U.S. retailers and ultimately the U.S. consumers. If tariffs were placed discriminately against Bangladesh, then they would become less competitive and less attractive. If tariffs were applied across the board, however, then Bangladesh's relative position doesn't change. Now, one goal of a trade policy could be to stimulate domestic manufacturing. So there could be a point at which tariffs make imported goods less competitive vis-a-vis domestic produced goods. And there could be a shift in both retailing and consumer behavior. I'm not an expert on the garment industry, but I think that is a significant hurdle that would have to be overcome, given the wide disparities in terms of costs, et cetera. There's also ultimately the willingness of the US consumer to pay significantly more for products. So I think trade policy, tariff policy is important for Bangladesh, but I wouldn't, again, get overly concerned about this. And certainly the Trump administration's decisions on trade policy are going to be informed by broader issues and not being imposed as a punitive measure on Bangladesh to try to, influence the political environment. The final thing I would say on trade and tariff issues is that obviously these are ones that require also the input of the U.S. Congress. And even with a Republican majority in the House and the Senate, there may well be significant opposition to these changes that are being talked about. So we'll have to see how that will all play out.
Okay, great. John, President-elect Trump is widely known as anti-immigrant president, right? And he has vowed to abolish the birthright citizenship. How do you think Mr. Trump's anti-immigration policies may impact expatriate Bangladeshis living in the USA?
So I wouldn't say that President Trump or others in his party are anti-immigrant. I think the conversation in the United States has really been about regulating immigration and ensuring that individuals who aspire to immigrate to the United States do so through legal pathways. So much of the conversation has been about the security of our borders, about those who enter the United States through irregular channels, and who seek to gain, some kind of status outside the normal ways of getting a visa, etc. So I would say that for those Bangladeshis or others who have followed those legal pathways, there's nothing to worry about. For those who don't have the status that would be conferred by following the normal pathways, um, they're obviously going to have to see how immigration policy evolves. Again, this will be something that the administration and the Congress will work on together. The courts will no doubt be involved. There may be some things the president is able to do through executive action. Um, Immigration is clearly a very emotional issue in the United States. All of us, in some way or another, are the descendants of immigration. So I think,
including
again,
including Mr. Trump.
including Mr. Trump, including myself. So all of us have, or most of us have, an immigrant story in our past. The U.S. immigration system has changed over the years, and is changed in response to both domestic and international factors. We may be entering onto a period now where there is more change, but I don't think that the Bangladeshi community per se should be worried, as this is something which is going to be, again, a broader conversation in the United States, certainly not one directed at the Bangladeshi community.
Right. Do you personally think President Trump will implement abolishing the birthright citizenship, or do you think he was just talking it for his fan base for some vote?
Yeah, I'm not a lawyer or constitutional expert. I would assume that an issue as fundamental as this would be something that would have to be addressed, both through legislation and ultimately through the courts. So I think, regardless of what you may be hearing now, I think a decision on whether something is fundamental as birthright citizenship is going to be altered is going to be a longer term issue and subject to a lot of discussion.
Yeah, okay, great. Let's talk about India and Russia relationship. India overtook China as the world's biggest importer of Russian oil in July. Russia crude made up a record of 44% of India's overall imports last month, August, rising to a record 2.7 million barrels per day, which is 4.2% higher than the June and 12% more than the year ago. So it's increasing. Data on Indian shipments from the trade and industry already confirmed that. What changes do you see will take place in the US and India relationship under the President Trump's administration, given that Trump is a friend of Mr. Modi, but India buys billions of dollars of oils from Russia, which United States are supporting Ukraine? How do you analyze this situation?
So a couple things. I mean, obviously, these are complicated issues. The U.S. and India relationship has many different facets. And as I've mentioned, there are some areas in which the U.S. and India agree and work closely together. There are other areas in which we disagree. When you add other parties, including Russia, that complicates the issue further because it brings in both those other bilateral relationships and also multilateral relationships. It brings in questions of United Nations sanctions. It brings in questions of policies of other countries, including, again, the Europeans. So I think there will be a natural focus on these issues. But again, I don't anticipate that there would be a dramatic change just because of President Trump coming to office. I think, again, President Trump, with regard to Russia and Ukraine, has stated his desire to help facilitate an end to that conflict. And I think there are many people around the world, including many who voted in the United States, who would see that as a good thing, to see the wars in Ukraine and, by extension, the wars in the Middle East and elsewhere end, and to prevent conflict in other parts of the world. And certainly, I would think India and the United States would share an interest in resolving conflict and promoting economic development and the betterment of the lives of their people.
Yeah, you mentioned about Russia and Ukraine conflict, also some conflict in Middle East. Do you think President Trump will somehow make these wars stop during his presidency? If so, how soon? If not, why not?
Well, he certainly ran on the premise that he would be in a position to help facilitate peace agreements in both conflicts. And I think everyone should wish him well in this regard. Obviously, these are big, broad issues that will require a lot of different parties to provide their input. The wars have been going on for quite some time. They're complicated issues, but this is something I think we should all watch and hope for success. War doesn't serve the interests ultimately of people of any of these countries. So we hope that there will be peace.
So you personally think Mr. Trump was serious when he talked about stopping wars around the world? He was just not saying it for the vote, right?
Yeah, no, I don't have any reason to doubt President Trump's sincerity and his desire. Again, there are very few, if any, who benefit from these conflicts, and certainly from a United States perspective, it would be best to see these conflicts being resolved.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that you know, many of the Bangladeshis who are also US citizen, Bangladeshi origin US citizen, they actually voted this time for President Trump with the only hope that he would help stop the wars in Middle East and Ukraine and whatnot. Many of them who didn't vote for Mr. Trump in 2016 did vote for him in 2024 on the single promise, just that you know.
Thanks. And just on that, I mean, my personal philosophy is that there's nothing more important for a citizen in a democracy than to express their preferences through the ballot box.
Mhm.
And I think appeals to individuals based on their group identity are misplaced in a functioning democracy. I think each individual should vote their conscience based on their holistic view of the candidates and their policies and how they best further, the goals that that individual has and the goals of the country. And that goes for Bangladesh as well. I mean, many people have accused me and others who were critical of the previous regime of wanting to have a certain other party or individual come to power. And nobody believed me when I said that, frankly, I couldn't care less who's in charge in Bangladesh. All I want is the people of Bangladesh to have the opportunity to go to the polls and to freely express their views and let the majority determine the country's political future.
Yeah, hopefully that happens. John, let's talk about the Rohingya crisis. As you know, Bangladesh is hosting the large number of Rohingya refugees since the unrest in Myanmar. How do you think USA can help Bangladesh mitigate this Rohingya crisis? Any specific US plan to help?
So again, the Rohingya issue is a long-standing one. It goes back, many decades. And as I mentioned in other fora, one of my jobs when I was in Dhaka as a political officer in 1991 was to look after refugee issues. And at that time, there was another large influx of Rohingya refugees. So obviously, the ultimate goal of any policy regarding refugees is to allow them to return home safely and with dignity as conditions allow. So the ultimate solution to the Rohingya refugee problem lies in Burma and having conditions created in which those refugees can go home. Until that happens, however, others have responsibilities as well. As the country of first asylum, Bangladesh does have an international responsibility to provide assistance, and Bangladesh has done so with the assistance of the international community. And I'm proud that the United States has been the largest provider of assistance in this regard. There are also opportunities to resettle refugees, including Rohingya, in third countries. And there are ways in which the international community can work with the government of Bangladesh to both meet the needs of refugees in Bangladesh, but also to recognize the impact this has had on host communities and to provide assistance that helps to mitigate those impacts. One thing that I hope will change in Bangladesh with the new government taking power, and we've already seen signs that this is the case, is that the Rohingya will stop being used as a kind of a political issue. I think the previous government used the Rohingya refugee issue as a way, frankly, to blackmail the international community. Also, I think fundamentally, The previous government saw the Rohingya as a potential fifth column, that they saw them as religiously and otherwise more conservative, and they feared that somehow they would end up supporting the political opposition. And this very much informed how Bangladesh treated those refugees. One of the most cynical aspects of this is that while people were calling for others in the international community to accept third country resettlement, it was the government of Bangladesh that was blocking this. The United States and others had offered to accept more Rohingya refugees being resettled, and this was blocked by the government of Bangladesh. So again, I'm hoping that the government of Bangladesh will adopt a new policy. I see signs that that is happening. And then I expect that the international community will respond with the US continuing to play an important role. But this is not a responsibility for the US alone. There are many others in the region and around the world who also have a role to play.
Okay, but you don't see any specific plan that US is working with Bangladesh and the regional partner to solve this issue. The hosting the refugees is temporary. It cannot be forever. It cannot go for generation after generation, right? This should be temporary, and there should be a permanent solution for the Rakhine region of Myanmar. You don't see any US plan, policy, assistance towards that permanent solution right now.
So I see that this is something that the US and Bangladesh are continuing to discuss on a regular basis, and I'm sure that that will continue. Again, the US has a role to play, but this ultimate solution is going to be much broader than a bilateral issue between the US and Bangladesh. Others in Southeast Asia, others within the Muslim world, others in Europe, and other friends of Bangladesh also have an important role to play. In terms of the ultimate solution, as I said, it's important that the situation in Burma stabilize to the extent that individuals no longer feel the need to flee, and hopefully conditions can be created so that refugees will return home. But I've served in a number of countries that have had long-standing refugee situations, and I think there needs to be an understanding and an acceptance in Bangladesh that for some of these individuals, those who have been in Bangladesh for generations, those individuals are never going to be going home. So finding some way to integrate them into Bangladeshi society is probably the durable solution for some number of those who have taken refuge in Bangladesh.
Okay. John, would you tell us more about the U.S. position on the ongoing unrest in Myanmar? It looks like USA is supporting the rebels, not the government, but the rebels in Myanmar. What does Burma want to achieve?
Yeah, again, this is an area probably outside my area of expertise. I think the U.S. recognizes that Burma is an important country, bridge between South and Southeast Asia. Obviously, as part of a broader Indo-Pacific strategy, we would like to see the development of a democratic regime in Burma that respects the rights of its citizens and acts responsibly as part of a broader region. And there would be opportunities for the U.S. and Burma to improve their relationship over time. But in terms of specifics of U.S. policy, that's really something beyond my scope.
Okay. John, let's talk about US and Bangladesh again. You did mention that the people of Bangladesh decided their own path in July and August, right? And but on the other hand, because Sheikh Hasina talked many times about the US role to out him out of the power, her out of the power. What do you think? What specific role US had in the July revolution in Bangladesh? Is there any?
Again, perhaps the United States served as inspiration. When people are fighting for their rights and democracy and freedom, they often look outside to sources of inspiration of other countries that have that kind of environment. And I hope that still the United States serves as that beacon. I'm sure that some of those fighting for freedom in Bangladesh um, appreciated the fact that they were not alone, that they knew that they had support. And I think the degree to which individuals in the United States, including and importantly the members of the diaspora, spoke out on behalf of the freedom fighters in Bangladesh, I think that was a source of inspiration. But in terms of specifics, as far as I can tell, the United States did not play a direct role. The United States had no foreknowledge of the protests and the events that were going to take place. The United States did not direct these. They did not have a U.S. blueprint for it. The U.S. Embassy in Dhaka and others in the U.S., I'm sure, maintained contact with individuals involved in these movements to try to understand what was happening. But this was not in any way something that the United States played a major role in. And to suggest that the United States or others played that role really is to denigrate the sacrifices of those who fought and died for freedom in Bangladesh. So anyone who's kind of playing that foreign card really, I think, has to look in the mirror and recognize the domestic factors that led to the end of Sheikh Hasina's tenure and salute those who sacrificed, and some paid the ultimate sacrifice for Bangladesh's freedom.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. John Dr. Yunus is known for personally being friend with Clinton's, Biden, Obama's. Do you think, does that personally bother Mr. Trump? And also, let me ask you this: what should Dr. Yunus's interim government do to strengthen the relationship with the Trump's administration?
Yeah, well, obviously, I can't speak for President Trump, and I don't know him as an individual. There's normal human emotions, but somebody who's been in the public eye as much as President Trump, I'm sure has developed a pretty thick skin in terms of people who may have had different viewpoints than him over the years. Um, I don't anticipate that the Eunice factor, as it were, is going to be a major determinant going forward. Uh, Again, Professor Eunice rightly has a great deal of support and admiration around the world, including in the United States. He's been honored by US presidents and Congress and by a number of universities and private groups. There are a number of private individuals who banded together when Professor Eunice was being prosecuted and persecuted during the Awami League regime. So the support that exists for Professor Eunice, I think, was on full display when he was at the UN General Assembly. Not only did he have unprecedented meetings with US officials, but he also had meetings with leaders from around the world. So I don't think that whatever ties Professor Eunice may have had with senior people in the past Democratic administrations is going to serve as a significant impediment to a good relationship between the US and Bangladesh.
Okay, John. You kind of downplayed Mr. Trump's attention towards Bangladesh, but he did tweet out a sort of negative statement about Bangladesh right before his election, where he kind of accused the current Yunus-led government is apathetic on the so-called minority operation in Bangladesh, and he will restore the law and order and the mayhem, in his own words, that is going on in Bangladesh. How do you interpret that tweet? Why he tweeted right before the election about Bangladesh?
Sure. Well, I guess the first question, and again, this would not be unique to President Trump. The same would go for any candidate, including his Democratic opponent. Just because a message is issued under their name doesn't mean that they were personally involved in it. So whether President Trump himself personally wrote or approved of that message is a question
It's
for
from his tweet. It's from his official tweet.
right. But again, I think when I worked at an embassy and a tweet came out from an ambassador, that didn't necessarily mean that the ambassador had written the tweet. It might well have been the public affairs officer at the embassy who has the password to the ambassador's account and has permission to post on their behalf. So again, whether every message coming out from President elect Trump's Twitter or X account reflects his personal views or not, I don't know. But even saying that it did, I think if you look at the context in which that message was issued, it was during the heat of the campaign when President-elect Trump was trying to draw distinctions between himself and the Democratic nominee, and was trying to gain as much support as he could, both financial support from those who donate to campaigns and electoral support from those who individually or collectively can mobilize voters. So there is a constituency in the United States which clearly wanted President-elect Trump to speak out on that issue. He did so, and my assumption is that he did so with a view towards gaining that support. I don't think that you should necessarily, or any of us should necessarily interpret that as the final word on whether that will reflect what policy decisions will be made once the president is in office.
So not to take Mr. Trump's Bangladesh tweet so seriously?
I think no, it should be taken seriously. Any message from a political leader and a president-elect should be taken seriously. But I don't think it should be seen as the final word. I mean, policies and positions evolve. So again, my assumption is that the president-elect sent out that message based on information he was being provided by a group in the United States, which had a certain perspective. There are clearly other perspectives. So in the policy-making process, ideally, a variety of perspectives are taken into account. So after hearing those different perspectives, it may be that ultimately a decision that the administration takes might be somewhat different. So that's what I would expect. I would expect that any policy decisions about Bangladesh will be informed by a variety of viewpoints. The president will certainly continue to hear from those who were pushing a certain narrative, but there's a counter narrative. And I think one of the opportunities for the Bangladesh government through its foreign policy establishment and ultimately through its ambassador in Washington will be to help convey a different perspective perhaps on developments in Bangladesh and the US-Bangladesh relationship.
Many actually believe, and there was news too, that Sheikh Hasina's son, who is living in USA, Shajib Wajid Joy, deployed some lobbyists to influence Mr. Trump's and Trump administration's policy towards Bangladesh. How important is those lobbyists? What role they play? Can you tell us more in Washington?
Yeah, so I've written on this issue as well in terms of lobbying. I would say a couple of things. First, lobbyists exist and they perform a role within our political process. So certainly there are outputs. Whether you can link those outputs to outcomes, I think is a question. On this specific issue, it may have been that there were other individuals and other groups also involved in lobbying who shared the same objective. And some of these individuals have publicly claimed credit for it. They have pointed to President-elect Trump's message on X, and they've said that this was the result of their lobbying activity. I have no reason to believe or to doubt that, so I'll just leave that as it were. So I guess it depends on what your definition of success is. We often see, for example, photographs of Bangladeshi officials or politicians with U.S. counterparts, and I wouldn't be surprised in some cases if those photo opportunities were the result of some lobbying effort, that a member of Congress or member of administration was persuaded by staff to agree to a meeting or a photo, and that had been pushed by a lobbyist. And maybe that has some value in a Bangladeshi context. Whether, however, that results in a change of policy is a different matter. And I'll just mention one quick anecdote. When I was working on Bangladesh issues in the late 1990s, Bangladesh had hired a lobbying firm to advocate for increased duty-free, quota-free access for Bangladesh ready-made garments.
That was
so the lobby.
That
Sorry?
was successful. That
Well,
attempt was successful.
The attempt was not successful. The attempt was successful if the goal was simply to get meetings and to deliver messages. So certainly the lobbyists played a role in helping, I think, the Bangladesh government and the industry put forward their case. But at the end of the day, the US policy didn't change. So was the lobbying effort successful? I would argue no. Was it worth the money that was spent? I'll leave that as an open question. So I would not be overly concerned about lobbying. And there's a second part of it, which I've also written about, which is in the face of these lobbying efforts, is the answer for the government of Bangladesh now to hire its own lobbyists? And my argument on that is no, because I think the resources that would otherwise be invested in a lobbying campaign could be better used in reinforcing Bangladesh's own diplomatic presence. Give those resources to the individuals at the Bangladesh embassy and consulates. Let them use those resources to do the work that diplomats should do. So I don't think there's a magic bullet that lobbyists have, particularly in a case like Bangladesh.
Okay, that's a great point, actually. Um, One more question on the Hasina regime. Now that the information is coming out, it is estimated about, and this estimation is not accurate, it can go up more even. But so far, there are some talk about Hasina and her oligarchs were able to channel out about $90 billion offshore. Do you think USA can help Bangladesh government to bring some of those, if not all, back to the country again?
Yeah, well, first, I have no idea whether those figures bear any resemblance to reality. I'm certain that corruption took place, and I'm certain that proceeds of corruption made their way out of the country. And there's been some good work by investigative journalists, for example, in detailing the activities of some of Sheikh Hasina's oligarch cronies who purchased property abroad. So I'm sure it's happened, and I'm sure the numbers are significant.
One,
Whatever
one, of,
those
one of your minister bought 500 houses in UK.
Right, right.
That
No,
was
I've seen those reports. They're well done. I have no reason to doubt those. Um, so I think there is an opportunity for the government of Bangladesh to work with friends and partners around the world to help recover those stolen assets. A number of countries have pursued asset recovery programs with varying degrees of success. The United States has cooperated in the past with Bangladesh to recover stolen assets, and there were some cases initiated during the 2007-2008 period that ultimately bore fruit. But this is a long and challenging process that requires a lot of resources. So I hope that that process will begin, and I hope that whatever elected government comes at the end of the tenure of this interim government will continue that, because ultimately these funds were stolen from the Bangladeshi people, and the Bangladeshi people deserve to benefit from those resources.
okay, great. Um, John, one last question about the Hasina regime. In the July-August People's Revolution in Bangladesh, the police and the law enforcement and Hasina's party men were seen shooting live bullets towards the protest, and out of that, about anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 people died. Thousands of people got seriously injured. Do you think, since Hasina is not in Bangladesh, if Bangladesh attempts to get her via international court or international justice system, that would be something possible for Bangladesh with the help of partners like USA and other countries?
So from the beginning, I've emphasized the importance of accountability, that there be justice for those who committed crimes and justice for the victims and their families, not just of the events of July and August, but throughout the entire dictatorship period. And I feel very strongly about that. It's important that Bangladesh does so in a way that meets international standards and scrutiny, and I hope that those efforts will continue. Um, During the July, August period and before, I made the point multiple times that simply saying that you're following orders is not a defense. So it's not a defense for the security forces, and individual members of security forces should also be held accountable. That said, as a practical matter, it won't be possible probably to prosecute every individual involved in a crime. Other countries have faced similar challenges. How do you unravel something as massive? So there's often the need for a strategy of prosecution, perhaps having certain symbolic cases, perhaps focusing on the leadership and those with command responsibility. So again, this is something that Bangladesh will have to pursue. I think there's also a second phase of this, which is getting some discussion, which is how do you then have reconciliation? I agree that justice and accountability need to come first, but
Mhm.
ultimately, to break this cycle of violence and retribution, there also has to be some societal reconciliation, including with those who had served the previous regime, whether in the political arena or in government. And again, there are models that have been successful in other places, which I hope Bangladesh will adopt or at least take a look at.
Yeah, great. John, one of your article you wrote, and I quote, another very important stabilizing factor in the relationship is the growing confidence and engagement of the Bangladeshi diaspora in United States. What role you think Bangladeshi diaspora can play in US-Bangladesh relationship, and what role is important? Like how the USA wants to see Bangladeshi diaspora engaging in this kind of talk.
Right. So I'll start by saying what role I do not think they should play, which is simply as auxiliaries of the parties in Bangladesh. I mean, to me, there's nothing more um, kind of insidious than these overseas branches of the Bangladeshi political parties basically causing problems and disruption abroad, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere. I see that as entirely counterproductive. Certainly, there's an important role for Bangladeshi Americans to play within the US political process, and I encourage that. And I'm pleased to see increasing numbers of Bangladeshis being active in local politics or national politics. So there's certainly that political role. But beyond that, I think there are great opportunities for the Bangladeshi community in the United States to work together with counterparts in Bangladesh to strengthen those ties. Obviously, there are cultural and personal ties. There's important opportunities for business and investment in certain sectors like IT, for example, which are obvious ones. There's also been a philanthropic aspect of diaspora engagement through humanitarian work, through health experts sharing their talents with the people of Bangladesh. So I think there are a lot of opportunities. There are opportunities as well to help educate U.S. officials, members of Congress, members of the administration. For this to happen, though, I think there needs to be greater unity among the community in the United States. Not that everyone has to have the same viewpoint or has to be on the same platform, but the undermining each other is ultimately counterproductive if they share the same goals. And I think finding the right ways to tie in Bangladesh is important. There are already ties on academic institutions and think tanks, for example. These are an important bridge forward. There are ways for individual Bangladeshis to who live in the United States and have talents to contribute those back. And again, I think this is a case where there are successful models of other countries where um, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the International Organization for Migration, the World Bank, and others have also incorporated diaspora expertise into ongoing development projects. So I think there's a great amount of opportunity, and I'm hoping some of this can kick off in the very near future because I'm sure, as every year, there'll be many Bangladeshi Americans traveling back to Bangladesh over the coming months to see family, to attend weddings, and for many, there's probably a pent up demand because for a number of years they didn't feel confident going back. So hopefully that those discussions can be going forward even in the coming months.
Yeah, great. John, we are at the end of our show almost. Let's talk about you. The former Deputy Foreign Minister Shahri Alam tweeted, and I quote, he said, everyone must know this ex-diplomat not impartial. They never were, even when they were serving in Dhaka. Question is how they're doing it for free of charge. If not, who is paying them? He probably indicated you. What is your response?
Yeah, so what I would say on this is that it's disappointing to see those charges, particularly from somebody who I knew well and interacted with when I was in Bangladesh, and certainly somebody who, as an opposition politician, reached out to the U.S. Embassy and sought those contacts himself. So there was an element of, I think, hypocrisy in criticizing, the role of the international community. But be that as it may, my involvement and interest in Bangladesh is very simple. I spent a good part of my career working on Bangladesh. My family has deep linkages to the country. Not only did my wife and I live in Dhaka, but our four children did as well. We even have a cat we adopted from Bangladesh who's living here with us. So again, for our family story, Bangladesh is pretty important. And like many U.S. diplomats who served in Bangladesh, I only want to see the best for the country, and I want to see relations between our two countries move forward. After I retired from the State Department, I was asked to join the board of a not for profit, Right to Freedom, which works to promote democracy and human rights in Bangladesh and throughout South Asia. I've also been involved with a new quarterly opinion magazine, Essay Perspectives. So these both have given me platforms as well to do writing, to speak out. So I do so based on my own personal views and my own personal hopes for the relationship. And I'm also motivated in part by a degree of responsibility. I see the opportunities that were missed in the past for the US to perhaps play a more constructive role. And particularly during the dictatorship, as I saw those who I knew as friends and colleagues being personally victimized by the dictatorship, I felt a moral obligation to speak out to ensure that what had happened to them would never happen again in Bangladesh. And I maintain that commitment to this day. I know that those who disagree with me or who have a different viewpoint will launch all kinds of baseless attacks. They'll claim that I'm being paid by somebody else or that I am an agent of some foreign master. But the reality is, when I speak for myself and do so without any compensation. I was fortunate that after a career as a diplomat, I have a generous pension and benefits that support me and my family and give me the freedom and opportunity to engage as I wish on issues in Bangladesh and elsewhere.
So, John, just to clarify, no payment for these hundreds of tweets and writings and speeches you gave over the years?
I can say with all honesty that I've not received a penny from any source for any of the work that I've done to talk about democracy, human rights, and freedom in Bangladesh.
Yeah, Bangladesh is certainly lucky to have a friend like you, John. Last question. There is a speculation that you may join Trump's administration Department of State as a senior official. If offered, will you accept such a position?
So I don't know where that speculation would come from. And at present, I'm very happy where I am, living here in Massachusetts, and doing what I can to contribute to my community and watching my grandchildren grow up. So I'm happy there, and the future will hold what the future will hold.
Thank you so much, John, for your valuable time with me and my viewers. We really appreciate your kind, candid conversation with us today.
Great. It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Dear audience, as you have been listening, we are so lucky to have Jon Danilowicz, the former deputy ambassador to Bangladesh. We talked about so many issues that are crucial, including the US-Bangladesh relationship, India-Bangladesh relationship, Myanmar and the Rohingya crisis, and how the Dr. Yunus-led interim government should deal with Trump administration, and whether the Bangladeshi people and the new government has anything at all to worry about Mr. Trump's second presidency. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I invite you to watch our next show. Until then, be in peace, be happy, and stay alert. Thank you so much, everybody.